Before we get into this case, we need to step back. Because Delphi didn't start with Delphi. This season didn't start with Richard Allen. We walked you through case after case, not because they were identical, but because they weren't. Jill Behrman, Lauren Spearer, Joseph Smedley, Kimberly Dowell, Ethan Dixon, Kiana Davis, Kiara Phillips, Carrielle McDonald, Keani Welch. Different victims, different timelines, different investigations. But the same kinds of questions, gaps, assumptions, shifting narratives, unanswered details. And over time, if you were paying attention, a pattern started to form. Not a conspiracy, not a theory, a pattern of how cases are built, how they are interpreted, and how the public comes to understand them. And that's why this episode matters. Because Delphi is not just another case. It's what happens when all those patterns collide in one place.
And by the time this case reached trial, most people believed they already understood it. There was a suspect. There was evidence. There were statements. And for a lot of people, that was enough.
But Casewalker was never built to tell you what to believe. It was built to show you how to look, how to ask, what is this really saying? What does this actually prove? What's missing? And what are we assuming? Because if you don't ask those questions, you're not analyzing a case, you're accepting it. And this episode is where we stop accepting. We are not here to tell you Richard Allen is innocent. We are not here to tell you Richard Allen is guilty. We are here to walk the record. This episode is based on court filings, orders, and trial proceedings. We are not presenting new allegations. We are examining what the record shows, what was challenged, and how the case was presented. And at the end of this, you should not walk away thinking like us. You should walk away thinking for yourself. This episode is not a recap. It is not a trial summary. It is not a list of headlines. And it is not a simplified retelling of a case that was never simple to begin with. This is episode 8. And if you have walked with us through this season, through the timeline, through the documents, through the patterns, through the public records, through the procedural cracks, then this is the moment the entire season has been building toward. Because this is where we stop asking what people think happened, and we start asking what the record can actually support.
And that matters, because this case didn't just produce an arrest. It produced a narrative. And that narrative became so strong that questioning it started to look like a problem, as if asking about the process meant you didn't care about the outcome.
But that is exactly backward. Due process matters most in the cases that hurt the most. Fairness matters most in the case that inflamed the public the fastest. And transparency matters most in the cases where people are told to stop asking questions because the answer has already been decided for them. Because here is the truth we are going to walk through in this episode. This case became pivotal because it shows what happens when fear, publicity, secrecy, forensic interpretation, and public certainty all collide inside one prosecution. And that is why this episode matters far beyond Delphi. This is not only about Richard Allen. This is not only about Indiana. This is not only about one courtroom. This is about whether the system we all live under still functions the way we tell ourselves it functions. This is about whether the rights people believe they have actually remain intact once the full machinery of the state decides it has its man. This is about whether you, listening right now, would still believe in the presumption of innocence if the pressure had turned toward you. Because if the process can bend here, it can bend anywhere. And if a trial can raise serious questions about whether the process was fully tested, then the danger is not that this case is exceptional. The danger is that it isn't. And that is why this episode has to be big. Because to understand what happened here, you cannot cherry pick. You cannot clip moments and call it analysis. You cannot wave at a verdict and ignore the structure beneath it. You have to walk it. Line by line, motion by motion, order by order, claim by claim, ruling by ruling. And you have to show the listener what happened, when it happened, who asked for it, who fought it, what the court allowed, what the court blocked, and what all of that meant. That is what we are doing here, not storytelling, record work. And before we can go any further, we need to define something, because this is where most people misunderstand how a case begins. An arrest does not mean a case is proven. It means the state met a standard called probable cause. And probable cause is not certainty. It is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It is simply enough information for a reasonable person to believe a crime was committed, and that a specific person may be involved. That's a low threshold, which means someone can be arrested before the state has enough to convict them.
And that's where people get it wrong. Because once someone is arrested, it feels like a case is already strong. But legally, that's just the beginning. Because once the case moves to trial, the standard changes. Now the state has to prove guilt, beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is a completely different level of proof. So before we get into the confessions, before we get to the bullet, before we get to the science, before we get to the trial, we have to start where this case actually started to show its shape. And that is with control. Because one of the defining features of this case is that almost immediately it began closing itself off from the public. Not after the trial, not years later, right away.
On October 28, 2022, the state filed a request to prohibit public access to key court records, including the probable cause affidavit and charging documents, arguing that releasing that information could create harm and impact the investigation. And the court temporarily sealed those records, pending further hearing. So before the public even had access to the foundation of the arrest, the system had already created a barrier between the case and public visibility.
And that becomes one of the defining tensions of this case. On one side, control, restriction, and protection of the investigation. On the other, pressure for transparency, because the media didn't just ask questions, they intervened.
Multiple media organizations formally stepped into the case, challenging the restriction of public access and arguing that the public had a right to see the documents that formed the basis of the arrest. And that matters, because this was not passive reporting. This was a legal fight over access, over visibility, over whether the public could evaluate the case for themselves. And that leads to one of the most important truths in this entire episode. This case was never just a prosecution. It was also a battle over who got to see the case being built. And that is a very different thing.
Because once you understand that, everything else starts to make more sense. The protective orders, the discovery limits, the sealed filings, the hearing battles, all of it. This wasn't random. This was the environment the case existed in. This became a case shaped by limited visibility.
And if you think that sounds abstract, let's make it concrete. At the initial hearing, Richard Allen was formally charged with 2 counts of murder under a felony murder theory tied to kidnapping. And almost immediately, the weight of that charge shaped public perception. 2 victims, murder, kidnapping. That combination changes how a case is viewed before it is ever tested in court. At that same stage, bond was set at an extremely high level and then removed entirely, with Allen being held without bail pending further proceedings. So look at the sequence. The records are sealed. The foundation is not yet public. The charges are severe. The detention is immediate. This is not a neutral environment. This is pressure.
And then the structure shifts again, because the original judge recuses, and a special judge is appointed. So early in the case, you already have judicial change, procedural pressure, and high public attention. That is not a typical starting point.
And from that point forward, what you see is not a case becoming more open. What you see is a case becoming more managed, more controlled, more contested, more restricted. Who sees what? When they see it? What can be said? What can be challenged? What gets in? What stays out? This becomes a case about knowledge. How we know what we know, and how much of that knowledge was shaped before it was ever tested. This is not dramatics. This is structure. And systems do not automatically produce truth. They produce outcomes based on how they are built. And when a system begins with restricted access, controlled information, and limited visibility, you are not just looking at a case. You are looking at an environment.
And once you understand that, everything else in this case starts to connect. The evidence, the statements, the debates, the limitations, none of it exists on its own. It all exists inside that environment.
And that is why we don't skip ahead. Because if you jump straight to the confessions, you miss the conditions. If you jump straight to the bullet, you miss the interpretation. If you jump straight to the verdict, you miss the structure that shaped what the jury saw. And if you do that, you are not examining the case, you are consuming it. Casewalker does not consume cases. We walk them. A fair trial is not measured only by whether procedures were followed. It is measured by whether the defendant had a real, meaningful opportunity to test the state's case. Not in theory, but in practice. And that is the question we carry forward. So now we move to the engine of the case, the affidavit, the timeline, the witnesses, the video, the round, and the foundation that everything else was built on. That's where we go next. To understand how this case was built, you have to start with the document that justified everything that came after it. The arrest, the charges, the detention, the narrative, all of it. That document is the probable cause affidavit, filed in Carroll Circuit Court, State of Indiana versus Richard M. Allen. And before we even begin walking through it, we need to be disciplined about what this document is and what it is not. The probable cause affidavit is not proof. It is not tested evidence. It is not cross-examined testimony. It is not a verdict, and it is not a finding of guilt. It is the state's written argument that there is enough reason, enough probable cause, to believe a crime was committed and that the person named in the affidavit may have committed it. That's it. So when we walk through this document, we are not treating it as truth handed down from the court. We are treating it as what it is: the state's version of events, built from selected facts, arranged in a persuasive sequence for the purpose of justifying an arrest.
And that matters because this is where the public version of the case really takes shape. This is where the timeline gets defined, the witness descriptions get framed, the bridge video gets interpreted, and the physical evidence gets connected. And once that narrative is released into the world, it becomes very hard to separate what the affidavit says from what people assume it proved.
And that is exactly why we're going to slow this down, because a probable cause affidavit does two things at once. First, it presents information. Second, it arranges that information in a way designed to move the reader toward a conclusion. That doesn't mean it's false. It means it is purposeful. And if you want to understand how a case is built, you have to learn how to read both, what the affidavit says and what the affidavit is trying to do. According to the affidavit, on February 13th, 2017, Abigail Williams and Liberty German were dropped off near the Monon High Bridge Trail. The affidavit places that drop-off at approximately 1:49 p.m. That matters because once a case starts with a timeline, everything that follows gets measured against that framework. Time becomes structure, and structure becomes persuasion. From there, the affidavit moves toward one of the most important moments in the entire case. At approximately 2:13 p.m., Liberty German's phone records video of a male walking on the bridge, and in that video, a voice is captured saying, "Guys, down the hill." That phrase becomes the center of gravity in the case, not just emotionally, but structurally. Because from that point forward, the affidavit is working to connect one claim to another. There's a male on the bridge. That male is interacting with the girls, and therefore, that male is being treated as the person responsible for what happened next.
And this is where the listener needs to slow down with us, because that move from man on the bridge to man responsible for the murders is the critical move in this affidavit. And it is not proven in the affidavit. It is asserted through sequence. That distinction matters because once the sequence is persuasive enough, people stop noticing where inferences begin.
This is one of the most important things to understand about probable cause documents. A timeline does not just organize events, it creates momentum. It makes the reader feel like they are moving toward clarity, toward inevitability, toward a conclusion that seems to emerge naturally from the order of facts. But order is not the same thing as proof, and that matters here, because once the affidavit gives you the drop-off time, the phone video, the phrase, "Guys, down the hill," it has already created the emotional and narrative frame the rest of the document is going to live inside. The affidavit then describes the individual in the video, what the public came to know as Bridge Guy. The description includes a male, blue jeans, a dark jacket, walking with hands in his pockets, and then witness statements enter the document. Multiple people describe seeing a male on or near the trail. Their details vary, but the affidavit emphasizes areas of overlap. The clothing, the build, the general appearance, the movement. This is important because the affidavit is not listing witness statements. It is curating alignment.
And that's a really important teaching moment because witnesses do not function as surveillance cameras. They are not recording devices. They are not perfect memory systems. They are people. People who observe something briefly, people who may have been outside, moving, distracted, uncertain, or simply not realizing in that moment that what they were seeing would later become part of a murder investigation. So when the affidavit lines those witnesses' descriptions up, it is building a pattern, not presenting certainty.
Exactly. And that is the difference between consistency and identification. The affidavit is presenting consistency. It is not presenting a witness who says with certainty and precision, "That is Richard Allen." And in a case like this, those are two very different things. Now we get to the moment where Richard Allen is pulled into the timeline. According to the affidavit, in 2017, shortly after the murders, Allen voluntarily spoke with law enforcement. And in that interaction, he stated that he had been on the trail that day, he had walked on the Monon High Bridge, and he had been there during the general time frame of the murders. That's important because it places him at the scene. But placing someone at a scene is not the same thing as proving they committed the crime that occurred there.
And that's another place where people tend to jump ahead too fast. Because in a public case, presence feels incriminating. But legally, presence and guilt are not the same thing. Especially in a public location, especially on a trail, especially where multiple people were out that day. So yes, this matters. But it does not do the entire job on its own.
The affidavit also says Allen described clothing similar to what the male in the video appeared to be wearing. And this is where the state's theory begins to tighten. Because now the affidavit is stacking a male in the video, witness descriptions of a male, and a man who admits he was there wearing similar clothing. That is not proof, but it is narrative convergence. And that is how probable cause documents work. They don't have to remove every doubt. They only have to create a persuasive enough structure to support the arrest.
So let's stop and say out loud what this affidavit is actually doing. It is taking a set of facts that, standing alone, each have limitations, and arranging them so they support one another. For example, video alone does not identify Allen. Witness memory alone does not conclusively identify Allen. Allen being present alone does not establish murder. Similar clothing alone does not establish guilt. But when you stack them, the affidavit wants the reader to experience them as reinforcing. That is not accidental. That is the architecture of the document.
Now we move to what became, for many people, the most powerful part of the state's case: an unspent .40 caliber round recovered near the victims. According to the affidavit, investigators determined that this round had, quote, been cycled through, end quote, a Sig Sauer P226 firearm belonging to Richard Allen. That phrase, quote, cycled through, end quote, is one of the most important phrases in the entire case, because for a lot of listeners and for a lot of readers, it sounds pretty definitive. It sounds like the gun is his, the round matches the gun, therefore the round ties him to the scene. But inside that phrase is a level of technical complexity that the affidavit does not fully unpack.
Because a round being, quote, cycled through, end quote, a gun is not the same thing as being fired from it. And that is not a small distinction. That is a foundational one. So when the affidavit presents this as one of the central pillars of the case, it is giving you the conclusion first. The scientific limitations come much later, if they come at all.
And that matters because this is the exact point where a probable cause affidavit starts doing rhetorical heavy lifting. The affidavit does not stop and teach the reader what cycling means, how toolmark comparison works, what the limitations are, or whether there are competing views within the field. Instead, it gives the reader a clean, forceful connection. And in public consciousness, that kind of connection travels fast. The affidavit then describes the search of Richard Allen's home. Law enforcement obtained a warrant. During that search, they recovered a Sig Sauer P226 handgun. That weapon was submitted for testing. And the results of that testing are what the state uses to connect the firearm to the round found near the victims.
So at this point, in the affidavit, the structure of the state's theory looks like this. Allen places himself on the trail. Witnesses describe a similar male. The video captures a male on the bridge. A round is found near the victims. That round is said to have been cycled through Allen's firearm. And when you put all of that in sequence, you can feel what the affidavit wants the reader to feel, that the circle is closing.
At the end of the affidavit, the investigator writes, in substance, that based on witness statements, the video, Allen's own admissions, and the firearms evidence, they believe Richard Allen is, quote, the male seen on the video, end quote. That is the conclusion. That is the state's theory. And that theory is what supported the arrest. But now we need to say the next part clearly, because this is where a lot of people stopped thinking. The fact that the affidavit reaches that conclusion does not mean the conclusion is proven. It means the state reached it. And then it becomes the defense's job, and the court's job, and ultimately the jury's job to test whether that conclusion can survive scrutiny.
Now here's the part most people don't stop to think about. Once this document is filed, and once it becomes public, it doesn't just exist in a court file. It enters the world. And when it enters the world, it becomes the version of the case that people carry around in their heads. Because it is structured, authoritative, linear, and emotionally coherent. It answers the question people are already asking. Did they find the guy? And once the public starts living inside that answer, it becomes very hard to reverse that momentum.
But the probable cause affidavit is not supposed to be the final word. It's supposed to be the beginning of testing, the beginning of challenge, the beginning of adversarial scrutiny. And that is where this episode changes direction, because what happens next is not just about what the state presented. It is about what the defense was able to challenge, what they were allowed to challenge, and what the jury was ultimately permitted to hear. Because if this affidavit is the foundation of the case, then the next question is unavoidable. What happens when that foundation is tested? And more importantly, what happens when parts of that testing are limited, restricted, or excluded? That's where we go next. We need to slow down here, because this is the moment in the case where most people stop asking questions. The bullet. The idea that a single piece of physical evidence ties Richard Allen directly to the crime scene. On its face, sounds simple. A round is found near the girls. It is examined, and investigators determine that it is connected to Allen's firearm. And for a lot of people, that's where the conversation ends.
But that's not where the science ends. And it's not where the analysis ends. Because the language used in this case matters. And if you don't understand the language, you don't understand the evidence.
The affidavit does not say that the round was fired from Richard Allen's gun. It says the round had, quote, been cycled through, end quote, his firearm. That is not a minor detail. That is the difference between a fired cartridge case and an unspent round that has been chambered and ejected. And if you don't understand that distinction, you don't understand what this evidence actually is.
So let's break that down. When a round is fired, the primer ignites, pressure builds rapidly, the casing expands against the chamber, and the gun leaves marks under force. When a round is cycled, it's loaded into the chamber, it contacts internal parts of the firearm, and then it's ejected. No firing, no expansion, no high-pressure event. Different conditions, different mechanics, different marks. So when we're talking about a round that was cycled through a firearm, we are not talking about the same kind of evidence as a fired casing. And that matters more than people realize.
The state's position relies on firearms examination, specifically toolmark comparison. This involves examining the surface of a cartridge under magnification, looking for patterns, striations, marks left by contact with the firearm, and then comparing those patterns to a known weapon.
But this is where people need to recalibrate what they think this process is. It is not DNA. It is not a fingerprint. There is no database that says this pattern equals this gun with statistical certainty. There is no universal measurement that produces a probability like 1 in a billion. Instead, what the examiner is doing is visually comparing marks, evaluating agreement, and making a determination based on training, experience, and interpretation. And in the language of the field, that determination is subjective.
Now, we need to be very clear here. Subjective does not mean useless, but it does mean dependent on human interpretation, and that has limits. Because the examiner is not measuring something with a fixed, universally accepted standard. They are deciding whether two sets of marks appear similar enough to conclude they came from the same source.
And that's where variability enters, because not every mark is unique. Marks can come from the manufacturing processes, normal wear, repeated cycling, contact with other surfaces, and in some cases, you can have marks that look similar without coming from the same firearm. That's not speculation, that's a known limitation of the method.
Now we move out of theory and into the record. Because in this case, This was not uncontested science. There were issues raised about the lack of agreement in certain markings, the possibility of subclass characteristics, and limitations in the comparison process, which means not every mark aligned, not every feature matched cleanly. And that matters, because in a criminal case, the question is not whether something sounds convincing. The question is it reliable enough to support a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt?
And this is where the case shifts, because the defense does not say, we disagree with the conclusion. They say this method itself is not reliable enough to support that conclusion. And that is a completely different level of argument. They bring in an expert, Dr. William Tobin, a forensic metallurgist, decades of experience studying how metals behave. And his role is not to say this round came from a different gun. His role is to ask, can this kind of analysis support the claim being made at all?
And this is where we need to stop again, because this is one of the most important moments in this entire case. Dr. Tobin was not allowed to testify. The court ruled he was not a firearms examiner. He had not personally examined the evidence, and his testimony was not sufficiently relevant. So the jury never heard that challenge. They never heard a direct, structured critique of the method itself.
And that changes everything. Because now the question isn't just, what is the evidence? It becomes, what was the jury allowed to hear about that evidence? Because if a challenge never reaches a jury, it doesn't exist in their decision-making process.
This is one of the hardest truths in any trial. A jury does not hear everything. They hear what is admitted, what is allowed, what survives evidentiary rulings. They do not hear excluded experts, suppressed arguments, or full scientific debates. So when the jury hears this round is associated with this firearm, they're hearing that statement without necessarily hearing the full scope of limitations, criticisms, or competing interpretations.
So now we step back, because this is the real question. What weight should this evidence carry? Is it definitive, supportive, suggestive, or uncertain?
And that answer depends entirely on how you understand the science. If you treat it like fingerprint level certainty, it feels overwhelming. If you understand the limitations, it becomes something else. Not meaningless, but not absolute. And this is why this evidence is so powerful, because it feels physical. It feels tangible. It feels like something you can point to and say, that ties him to the scene.
But what you are actually dealing with is an interpretation layered onto a physical object. And that interpretation comes from a method. And the method is where the debate lives.
So the question is not, is there a bullet? There is. The question is, what does that bullet actually prove? And more importantly, how certain is that proof? Because in a criminal case, certainty is not a feeling. It is a legal standard. Now, we've walked the science, we've walked the method, we've walked the challenge, and what the jury did not hear. So now we move to the next layer. Because if the bullet is one pillar of the case, the statements are another. And what we're about to walk through is where this case becomes even more complex.
Because this is where the question shifts again. From what does the evidence show to what do those statements actually mean?
If the bullet is where the case becomes technical, the statements are where the case becomes human, and also where it becomes the most uncomfortable. Because when people hear the word confession, they don't hesitate. They don't analyze. They don't slow down. They don't ask, when was it said? How was it said? What else was said around it? What condition was that person in? They hear one thing, confession. And for a lot of people, that's the end of the case.
But inside this case, it's not that simple. Because what exists in the record is not a single clean structured confession. It is a series of statements made over time, under specific conditions, in different contexts, with contradictions, with inconsistencies, and with serious questions surrounding them.
In the trial record, there are statements attributed to Richard Allen that include, quote, "I'm sorry I killed those kids," end quote. That is a powerful sentence, and it deserves to be treated carefully, because that sentence, on its own, sounds definitive. But the record does not stop there.
Around those statements, you also see references to confusion, irrational ideas, statements that don't align with known facts, shifting explanations. And that matters because context determines meaning.
This is not a case where there is one recorded confession in a structured interrogation with consistent detail, supported by independent verification. That's not what this is. What you see instead is a pattern of statements over time, multiple statements, different moments, different conditions, and the defense characterizes these as generic confessions, meaning statements that admit guilt without providing specific, verifiable details that only the perpetrator would know. And that distinction matters, because in criminal law, a confession is strongest when it is detailed, consistent, corroborated, and when those elements are missing, the reliability of the statement becomes a question. Now we need to move to something that cannot be separated from the statements, the environment. Because statements do not exist in isolation. They are shaped by conditions. And in this case, the environment was not passive.
Richard Allen was held pre-trial in a maximum security prison environment. Not a county jail, not a neutral holding facility, a prison environment designed for convicted offenders, high control management, restrictive conditions. And within that environment, there are documented conditions including isolation, constant monitoring, restricted movement, limited interaction. That is not neutral.
And this is where we need to be very precise, because this was not just a restrictive environment. It was a recorded environment. The state sought access to recorded phone calls, surveillance footage, interactions inside the facility, meaning this was not just a person speaking freely. This was a person speaking inside a system that was actively capturing what he said.
And that changes how you interpret statements. Because now you're not just asking what he said. You're asking how it was collected, who was listening, what was being documented.
And this is where it becomes even more serious. Because at one point, recordings were taking place during attorney-client interactions. And that practice had to be addressed. That matters, because those are supposed to be protected conversations. When even those lines are called into question, you are no longer dealing with a clean environment. You are dealing with an environment that raises serious concerns about confidentiality. At the same time, there are documented concerns about mental state, reports of decline, erratic behavior, difficulty communicating, refusal of medication, and at trial, questions are raised about whether his behavior could be explained by lack of medication, psychological deterioration, with responses acknowledging that's possible. Not confirmed, not dismissed. Possible.
And that word matters because when you combine isolation, control, surveillance, and mental health decline, you are no longer looking at a neutral environment. You are looking at a pressure environment.
So now we have to ask the question that actually matters. Not did he say something, but what do those statements mean? Because in a criminal case, a statement is not enough. It must be reliable, voluntary, and meaningful.
And reliability depends on consistency, coherence, context, and cooperation. So when you see multiple statements, inconsistent framing, lack of specific detail, and questions about mental condition, you cannot evaluate those statements the same way you would evaluate a structured confession.
And this is where the courtroom becomes critical, because the same statements are being interpreted in completely different ways. The state presents them as admissions. The defense presents them as unreliable, inconsistent, influenced by mental deterioration, lacking factual specificity. And the jury is left to interpret that.
So now we step back, because this is the contradiction at the center of this case. On one hand, you have statements that sound like admissions. On the other, you have conditions that call those statements into question. And both of those things exist at the same time.
This is not a situation where you can say, he confessed, so the case is closed, because the record does not support that level of simplicity. What you actually have is statements made over time inside a controlled environment, under pressure, with inconsistencies and competing interpretations. And that requires analysis, not assumption. So here's the question we carry forward. Were those statements a clear admission of guilt? Or were they the product of a person under pressure, deteriorating, speaking in ways that do not reliably connect to the facts? And the record doesn't resolve that cleanly.
And just like the bullet, these statements are not the entire case. They are one part, but they are part that carries enormous emotional weight. Because they feel final. They feel like an answer.
But in this case, they are not an answer. They are a question. A question about reliability, interpretation, environment, and pressure. And that question does not go away. So now we've walked two of the most powerful elements of this case, the physical evidence and the statements. And in both, what appears simple becomes more complex when examined. Which brings us to the next layer. Because if the evidence is debated and the statements are debated, then we have to look at something even deeper. The structure of the case itself. What was allowed? What was challenged? What was limited? And what that meant for the ability to test the state's case.
Because this is where the question changes again. From what evidence exists to was that evidence fully and fairly tested?
Up to this point, we've walked through what the state presented. The affidavit, the timeline, the bridge video, the witnesses, the round, and the statements. And in each of those, we've seen the same pattern. What sounds simple becomes more complex when you examine it. But now, we move to something even more important. Not the evidence itself, but the system that controlled how that evidence was handled. Because in a criminal trial, truth is not just discovered, it is tested. And the strength of that testing is what determines whether a conviction can be trusted.
So the question here isn't, what did the state have? It's, what was the defense allowed to do with it? Because that's the difference between a case being presented and a case being challenged.
One of the first structural elements you see in this case is control over discovery. The state requested, and the court granted, restrictions on how evidence could be handled, which meant materials could not be freely distributed, access was limited, use outside the case was restricted. And that matters, because discovery is not just paperwork. Discovery is how a case is tested.
And when you limit access, you don't just limit exposure. You limit review, collaboration, independent analysis, and scrutiny. Because if fewer people can see it, fewer people can challenge it.
This wasn't just a high-profile case. It was a contained case. Information did not move freely. It moved through controlled channels, under restrictions, inside boundaries. And that changes how a case develops. Because evidence is not just about what exists, it's about what can be examined. At one point, a hearing that would normally focus on bail shifted into something else entirely, a suppression hearing. And that matters, because suppression is not about detention. It's about existence, whether evidence will exist in the trial at all.
So now the court isn't just asking, should he be held? It's asking, should this evidence be allowed? And once that question is in play, everything changes. Because once evidence is suppressed, the jury never sees it. And once evidence is allowed, it enters the narrative.
So now we return to the bullet, but not the science itself, the ability to challenge the science. The defense brought forward Dr. William Tobin, a forensic metallurgist, decades of experience studying how metals behave, and his role was not to say this round came from a different gun. His role was to ask, is this method reliable enough to support the claim being made?
That is not a disagreement. That's a structural challenge. That's questioning the foundation, not the conclusion.
But the court ruled that Dr. Tobin would not be permitted to testify. The reasoning? Not a firearms examiner, did not examine the evidence directly, and not sufficiently relevant. So the jury never heard that challenge, never heard a structured critique of the method, never heard the broader scientific debate.
And that matters, because once a challenge is removed, it doesn't just disappear. It changes the shape of the case, because now the jury is evaluating evidence without its strongest opposing interpretation.
This is one of the hardest realities of any trial. A jury does not see everything, and jurors are not selected because they are forensic experts, legal scholars, or investigators. They are asked to evaluate highly technical evidence, conflicting testimony, and legal standards inside the limited frame the court allows them to see. That is not criticism of jurors. It is a reminder of how serious evidentiary limits become once a case is placed in their hands. They see what is admitted, what survives rulings, what is allowed into the record. They do not see the excluded experts, suppressed arguments, or full competing frameworks. So when a verdict is reached, it is not based on the full universe of information. It's based on a filtered record.
And that filtering is not neutral, because every limitation shapes interpretation. If you limit what experts can say, what evidence can be challenged, how challenges are presented, you are not telling the jury what to think, but you are shaping what they are able to think about.
At the same time, this case operated under a gag order, which restricted attorneys, law enforcement, and people connected to the case from speaking publicly. So once the state's narrative enters the public space, there is limited ability to respond to it in real time.
Which means public understanding and courtroom reality are not developing at the same pace, and not on equal footing.
Inside the courtroom, access was also controlled. No cameras, limited seating, restricted recording, which means the trial was not widely visible in real time, and that creates distance between what actually happens in court and what people believe happened. Now take a step back, because this is not about one ruling. It's about accumulation, controlled discovery, restricted access, suppressed challenges, excluded experts, gag orders, limited visibility. All of it layered together. And together, it creates the environment in which the case is decided.
And that environment becomes part of the case. Because a trial is not just evidence plus jury equals verdict. It's evidence filtered through rulings, presented under constraints, interpreted within limits, and then decided.
So now we come to the question that defines this entire episode. Not, was there evidence? Because there was. Not, did the jury reach a verdict? because they did. The question is, was the process strong enough to fully test the state's case? Because if the process is limited, then the testing is limited. And if the testing is limited, then questions about the reliability of the outcome become unavoidable.
And this is where people get uncomfortable. Because this isn't about choosing sides. It's about understanding systems. And systems are only as strong as their ability to be challenged.
So now, we've walked the evidence, the statements, and the system that controlled both. And what we're left with is not a simple answer. It's a set of questions. Questions about interpretation, reliability, limitation, and process. And now we move to the final part of this episode, because this is where everything comes together. The verdict, the meaning, and what this case tells us, not just about Delphi, but about the system itself. Because this case doesn't end with a verdict. It begins a conversation. After all of it, the affidavit, the timeline, the video, the witnesses, the round, the statements, the hearings, the rulings, the limitations. After everything that was presented and everything that was not, the jury returned a verdict. Richard Allen was found guilty. That is the outcome. And for a lot of people, that's where the conversation ends. A verdict is reached. A case is closed. Justice is served.
But that only works if you believe the process that produced the verdict was strong enough to carry it. Because a verdict, by itself, doesn't tell you how it was built. It doesn't tell you what was challenged, what was limited, what was excluded, or what never made it in front of the jury at all.
A verdict answers one question. Did the jury find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, based on what they were allowed to see and hear? That's it. It does not answer, was every relevant challenge heard? Was every limitation understood? Was the case fully tested? It answers a narrower question inside a controlled environment.
And once you understand that, you stop treating a verdict like the end of analysis, and you start treating it like the result of a process.
And in this case, the process is the story. Because what we've walked in this episode is not just evidence. It's how that evidence was interpreted, how it was challenged, and how those challenges were handled. And when you look at it that way, you're not just looking at Delphi anymore.
Because this isn't just about one defendant. It's about a system that decides what gets admitted, what gets excluded, what experts can say, what the public can see, and what the jury is allowed to evaluate. And if that system functions perfectly, the outcome reflects the truth. But if that system is limited, those limitations can affect how the outcome is understood.
And this is the part people don't want to sit with. Not that anyone's lying, not that anyone is acting in bad faith, but that the structure itself may not always be enough. That a case can feel complete while still containing gaps. That a narrative can feel convincing while still resting on interpretation. And that a verdict can feel final while still being built on a process that deserves scrutiny. Because it's easy to treat this as someone else's case, someone else's life, someone else's outcome. But the system doesn't change depending on who you are. The same rules apply, the same structure applies, the same limitations apply.
So the question isn't, what do you think about this case? The question is, what happens if you are inside one like it?
Most people grow up believing something simple. If you're innocent, the truth will come out. If something is wrong, it will be exposed. If there are questions, they will be answered. And if the system is working, it will protect you. But that belief depends entirely on the strength of the process.
And what this case shows is that the process is not automatic. It is structured, it is limited, it is controlled, and it only works as well as the space it allows for challenge.
In this episode, you've seen evidence that requires interpretation, statements that require context, science with limitations, and a system that defines what can and cannot be tested. And all of that feeds into one outcome. And this is why Casewalker exists. Not to tell you what to think, not to lead you to a conclusion, but to walk the record, to show you what was said, what was done, what was allowed, and what that actually means. So that when you hear a case, you don't just hear the result, you understand how it was built.
Because once you understand how a case is built, you can't unsee it.
And once you see it, you realize something else. This isn't about agreeing. It isn't about choosing a side. It's about asking whether the system we all live under is strong enough to deserve the trust we place in it. Because if it is, then scrutiny only makes it stronger. And if it isn't, then silence doesn't protect you. And once you understand that, you don't just consume cases anymore. You examine them.
This week's spotlight is Kylan Hammonds. Kylan is 16 years old and has been reported missing from Indianapolis, Indiana. According to reporting from WRTV and statements from family members, he was last seen on March 18, 2026, around 6 p.m. on the west side of Indianapolis, near the 6600 block of West 10th Street. His case is being handled by the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. Family members have stated this disappearance is out of character, and they are extremely concerned for his safety.
Additional information shared publicly indicates that Kylan left home on foot and has not been in contact since. The description states height 5'7", brown hair, brown eyes. Identifying features, a brown mustache. Kylan may have ties to the Muncie, Columbus, or Anderson, Indiana areas. At this time, there are concerns for his well-being.
If you have any information regarding the whereabouts of Kylan Hammonds, you are asked to contact the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST.
A missing person remains missing until they are found. And sometimes, cases move forward because someone notices something small and says something.
If you value the work we do here, the records, the research, and the time it takes to build these cases, you can support the Casewalker Chronicles through Patreon.
All of our work is built from documented sources. We cite those sources throughout each episode, and full source listings are available on our website. We're continuing to build this work, learning, advocating, and following the record wherever it leads. And that work doesn't stop here. It moves into real conversations, real spaces, and real engagement with others doing this work. Each connection gives this work another place to go, another opportunity to advocate and to continue asking the questions that matter. And we're grateful to have listeners like you supporting that work. This has been the Casewalker Chronicles.
And we hope you keep walking with us.